With that, I think it's time to open up the morning session, and I will turn things over to Laurie.
Good morning and welcome to the second day of the CFPB Research Conference. I'm Laurie Parcel and I'm an economist at the CFPB in the Office of Research, and I'd like to welcome you to this morning's first panel. As with our previous panels, this morning's speakers represent multiple disciplines, including both economics and psychology. Though varied in their approach, the four panelist papers explore how a consumer's background, knowledge, and expectations may influence financial outcomes. Specifically, they demonstrate the importance of context for consumer financial decision-making. Our first presenter this morning is Søren Leth Petersen. He is a professor of economics at the University of Copenhagen, where he performs research on consumption and savings and household finance. This morning, he will be presenting his work, Natural-Born Delinquents, Evidence from the Universe of Loans in Denmark.
Thank you, and thank you for putting me on the program. So let me just understand how this works. How do I flip through to the...
Big green button.
There you go. Good, thanks. So why do some people end up in financial trouble while others, they don't? Is it because of short-term shocks, or is it because of persistent differences in financial behavior? And we think of persistent financial behavior as being rooted in factors like risk attitudes, impatience, or impulsivity. And these factors we're just going to lump together and call them type characteristics. And we want to learn about the relative importance of these two factors because it has implications for, among other things, bankruptcy laws. So there's one type of bankruptcy law that some call fresh start systems, where people are discharged debt. And those kinds of systems, they emphasize the insurance aspects, so people they are insured against bad luck. At the other extreme, you got no fresh start systems, where people they hang on to their debt, and these are the systems that you find in Europe predominantly. And they emphasize the adverse selection part and try to discourage loans to types who are unlikely to repay. So we want to learn about the importance of persistent financial behavior. So you can imagine an extreme type of persistence where the behavior, where children are actually born to be the same type as their parents. So, and we're going to try to test this by measuring the intergenerational correlation in delinquency. So we have this data set that collects all loans that exist in Danish banks and financial intermediaries in the period 2004 to 2011. 4 to 11 is going to be called the data period here. And that means that we got records of almost 31 million loans in this data set. So we know the balance of the loan, we know the interest payments during the year, and then we know whether the loan has been delinquent. So that is if people have missed payments during the year. So we know the identity of the account holder, so we can link up to the population register. And in this period, there's about 4.7 million adults in Denmark. And because it's the population register and everybody is surveyed here, we can actually link people within families. So we use this to link up to parents here. And because we have the population register, we can link up to a host of other registers. In particular, we can link up to the income tax register, and that gives us information about income and assets dating back to 1987, so many, many years before the sample period that we are considering. Then we can link up to birth registers, and we're going to collect information about birth weight there. And then we can link up to school registers, and that we use to collect information about grades that people have obtained in middle school. And then we've issued a small-scale survey where we try to elicit these behavioral factors, so risk attitude, impatience, and impulsivity. And that we can link up to all the rest of the stuff, so we can correlate whether these factors actually predict anything that we're talking about in the admin data. So here just an overview of the aggregate delinquency in the data. So the top line gives just the raw delinquency rate. And it's kind of striking how constant it is over this period. So it's circling around 5%, only a small increase around the crises. The middle line gives the delinquency rate for loans which have a balance of at least $20,000. And this is just to show that this is not just delinquency, it's not just related to insignificant small loans. This is important at all levels of balances. The bottom line is mortgage delinquency rates, and that is, the reason it's so low has to do with Denmark's particular bankruptcy system, but also with the specific design of the mortgage system. So that's not really an issue. So this is the first graph of the intergenerational correlation relationship. So on the y-axis, we have the delinquency rate of children, and on the x-axis, we have the age of children. And then we stratified the sample into those children who have parents who themselves have a delinquent account, that is the top one, and children who have parents who do not have any accounts that are delinquent. And what you see is that there's a striking level difference. And in fact, it turns out that the ratio between these two lines is between 4 to 7 at all levels. And it turns out to be the same at all levels of balances. So it's not just something that relates to small accounts. This is throughout. And it's also kind of striking that you see this quick phase-in for those children who have parents that themselves have a delinquent account. It seems like that within 25, they've sort of reached their natural delinquency propensity. And that we find is sort of quite striking. So here I've just plotted, so the ratio between these two lines is 4 to 7. So here I've just plotted the ratio for each year. So where I measure parents in the same year throughout 4 to 11. And again, it's just striking how constant it is. It doesn't move at all. So I just want to show you two other facts before I go into a little bit of analysis. Here we plot, for the same two groups, we plot against deciles of grade point averages from middle school. And you see, of course, that delinquency is declining with grade point averages. But you also see this shift that holds true at all levels of school grades. So, and in fact, the ratio is again the same. It's 4 to 7 at all levels. So it seems like it's not just, it doesn't have to do only with cognition. It has to do with other things as well. Here we do it against, so we plot for the same two groups against vintiles of parental income. And again, you see this striking level shift. So it doesn't seem like it, at the face of it, it has to do with just the availability of resources. So we just, I know this is a ridiculously simple structure, but we want to impose just a little structure to be a little bit more clever about whether parents, they actually transfer behavior to their children. So what we do is to assume that delinquency is influenced by type, and by type we mean behavior that I talked about, and by shocks we mean things that has shocks that has happened in the data period. So that's in 2004 to 11. That's the period where we observe delinquency. So if you just start out from these two, from this simple structure, then you can think of at least three explanations for why there might be a correlation in delinquency. So the first could be a risk-sharing story. So parents, they might exhibit sound financial behavior, but they might have been exposed to an adverse shock that has rendered them unable to insure their children, and thus the children end up in delinquency. The second story could be that parents, they are actually bad types, so they end up in delinquency themselves, and they are unable to protect their children because they are themselves in trouble, even though the children might be exhibiting sound financial behavior. And then the third explanation could be that children actually inherit the type of their parents. So with this simple structure, we assume that the parental delinquency is influenced by type characteristics and by shocks, and that feed over to child delinquency. So we want to try to rule out explanation one, So explanation one was that parents, they exhibit sound financial behavior, but they have been exposed to a major adverse shock that has led them into delinquency. So, and therefore they're not able to protect their children from delinquency. So what we want to try to do is to close down the shock channel. And the strategy we pursue is to try to identify variables that are measured long time before the sample period. And the idea is that if they are measured long time before, then they can't be the result of shocks that has appeared in the sample period 2004 to 11. So we're going to identify two variables that we're going to use. So first note that the sample period is, see if I can use this. So the sample period here is 4 to 11. Actually, for the rest of the graphs I'm going to show you, I'm just going to show you delinquency based on 11 observations. So what we do now is to try to identify the financial assets of the parents back in this period, 1987 to 1994. And the idea here is that if parents, they are sort of relative impatient types, then you're going to observe that they are going to persistently hold low levels of financial assets during this period. And actually, when we plot, so what we do is to identify a variable, construct a variable that takes the value 1 if parents, they have financial assets corresponding to less than 1 month of income in any given year in this period. And then we just count how many years they have low levels of financial assets in this period. And when we then calculate the average number of years where they have low levels of financial assets, and then stratify by whether the parents are delinquent in 11 or not, then we find that those parents who are delinquent in 11, they have 6.5 years out of 8 with low levels of liquid assets, some 20 years before. Whereas those parents who are not delinquent in 11, they only had 4.3 years with low levels of liquid assets in this period, some 20 years before. So the next variable that we're going to use is birth weight of the child. And when we stratify the birth weight of children according to whether parents, they are delinquent in 11, then we find that parents who are delinquent, they had children that weighed on average 100 grams less than those parents who do not have delinquent accounts in 2011. So before I show you the IV estimates, I just want to show you the original graph. That's the one over there to the left. And then where we've stratified according to parents' delinquency status in 11. And here we stratify according to their delinquency status in 4. And what you see is that they are practically unchanged. And that alone suggests that there's something else going on than just shocks hitting people during the sample period. So if you just focus on the 90 percentage points difference here, because now I'm going to show you just the difference. So the bottom line is the difference that I just highlighted on the previous graph. And then the top line is the IV estimate. And it turns out that it doesn't matter which one of these instruments that we use, we get the same result. And it really points, so you see a sharp shift upwards. And that really suggests that parental type influences child delinquency. So we've now sort of established that parental type means something for child delinquency. But now we want to learn whether parents, whether it works through the channel where parents, they're not able to protect their children because they are in trouble themselves, or whether it's really the type thing. So we try to close down for the shock channel to the children. And the idea is just that if children, they don't receive any shocks, then it's probably not because parents, they haven't been not able to insure them. So we just construct a sample of children that has never been unemployed in this sample period. So they haven't had one single day of unemployment. And here's the basic graph that I've shown you before, and it's just identical. So it seems that something, I mean, obviously unemployment shocks is just one shock out of many shocks, but potential shocks. But it does suggest that there is something else going on here. So the last set of results I want to show you is based on the survey data. So we've issued a small-scale survey to a random sample of people. Then we've asked them to rate their patience, impulsivity, and risk willingness on a scale from 1 to 10. And we've asked the children to rate themselves, but also to rate their parents. And when we just correlate these two things, then we get a positive relationship. And we're fully aware of all the methodological issues there are in doing this. But still, it would be really concerning if we didn't find a positive correlation. And this kind of result is actually consistent with several other studies that has found its general correlations in these preference measures. What we do here is to correlate, to regress actual third-party reported delinquency of the children against their stated type characteristics. And what you see is that impulsivity and risk willingness correlate with actual delinquency. And it holds up even when we do it multivariately. And still risk willingness comes through when we put in a bunch of controls. The levels of significance may not seem impressive, but actually I find it pretty impressive that you can find these kind of correlations when you link up these different types of data. So this is at least consistent with the idea that there is some kind of type transfer. And by the way, when we do it for parents, for the characteristics of the parents reported by the children and relate that to the delinquency of the parents, then we also find significant correlations. So we find that delinquency is strongly correlated across generations. We find that birth weight and historical financial behavior is related to delinquency. All the things I've shown you are just bivariate graphs, but it holds up when we do it in a multivariate setting. Everything goes through in the same setting. So our conclusion is that children, they inherit bad financial behavior from their parents.
Our next presenter is Yi Li. He is an assistant professor of management and marketing at the University of California, Riverside. His research examines the affective, cognitive, and situational determinants of economic behaviors. This morning, he will be presenting his paper, Sound Credit Scores and Financial Decisions Despite Cognitive Aging.
Oh, sorry about that. Let's try this again. The slides are in your... Oh, got it. Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. So as I was saying, thanks to organizers for putting together this wonderful conference, for organizing this amazing group of speakers who I hope to raise to the bars set very high so far. We actually had to put give our slides a week ago, so I haven't had a chance to put in any sort of fancy disclaimer statement, which I will go above and beyond everyone else. My views are mine and mine alone. They do not represent any of the schools here, nor any of the states we reside in, or even the countries we're from. So maybe not even other co-authors, one of whom is here. So the other speakers so far have all been economists, and among economists, at least, I tell people I'm a psychologist. I'm a decision-making researcher by training, and in particular, I'm interested in what aspects of cognition and affect relate to economic behaviors. And today, I'm going to be talking about how your cognitive ability changes as you age may impact your ability to make financial decisions. So I'll start with a bit of a false dichotomy, and that's that when most people think of aging, one of two, or maybe both stereotypes will come to mind. One is of the wise old sage, and one is of the, let's say, senile senior citizen. And of course, as in all cases, the truth is far more complicated than this. It's going to depend on a lot of factors, which of these stereotypes is going to apply to you or your parents or your friends. And it's going to depend on a lot of factors, of which we're only going to explore one, and that's how your cognitive ability changes over time. And needless to say, I don't think I have to convince this audience that this is an important question. There are a lot of old people, and the number keeps increasing for whatever reason. Older adults control a lot of wealth. They control more wealth than any other age group, and this is true in almost every developed country. And what's more, as they age, with this greater power comes greater responsibility. They face a lot of extremely important and complex financial decisions, things like what to do with the retirement saving, both in terms of accumulating and spending it, health decisions like which healthcare plan to choose after I finish with my employer, same thing like estate planning. These are all extremely important, difficult decisions that even someone with a PhD in business, economics, decision making may have a hard time facing. Now the question becomes, can older adults do this sort of thing? So it's early in the morning, so it's perfect time for a pop quiz. This is a measure that we use in our studies, and the idea here is that we're gonna try to fill in this empty box. So there's some set of patterns among all the other age shapes which will give you a unique answer to this question. And because it's early in the morning, I won't burden you with this, maybe give you 5 seconds to think about it. But if you haven't, don't feel too bad. Here's how it works. So if you add up these first 2 shapes, you get this third shape on the right. Second 2 shapes, you get this shape on the right. So doing the same thing, you'll see that option B here is the correct solution. So this is one example of what we call the Raven's progressive matrix test. It is an extremely standard measure of abstract reasoning, and it's one of many measures which unfortunately seems to decrease as you age. So for things like reasoning, memory, speed, everyone's getting worse. From the time we were in our 20s, we're getting dumber. Sad but true. So all of these abilities together are referred to as fluid intelligence by cognitive researchers. So as I already mentioned, things like processing speed and efficiency, your ability to abstractly reason about things, problem solving, working memory, attention. Seems like a lot of things which might be important for decision making. So all of those get worse with age, but as it turns out, intelligence researchers distinguish between this type of intelligence, which I like to liken to your brain's raw processing power, your hardware, with what's called crystallized intelligence. This is your accumulated knowledge, experience, and expertise, what perhaps an economist would better refer to as intellectual capital. So I like to think of this as your brain's software. And as it turns out, we measure how good your software is with actually very simple measures, things like how much you know about the world in general and how much vocabulary you have. If this sounds a lot like crossword puzzle solving ability, it does in fact turn out that these measures are very highly related to that. And as you might expect, crossword solving ability actually increases with age. So good news is you actually are learning as you age, at least through your 60s, and I suspect that a lot of that flattening afterwards is really due to the fact that a lot of people are retiring and therefore being exposed to less new things. Oh, now we have an interesting question on our hands. We have 2 types of cognitive ability. Both of them seem relevant for decision making in all sorts of domains, in particular economic decision making as we study. And we will develop a very simple framework for thinking about how these 2 types of abilities might matter. We call this the Complementary Capabilities framework. And although this looks complex, it's really not. Basically, most people who study aging really only look at what is the effect of age on some dependent variable of interest. And what we're saying is, let's look underneath the hood, what else might be happening which might explain these changes. And in particular, we think almost every kind of decision can be solved in one of 2 general methods. You can either crunch the numbers, work out all the figures, and really use your brain's raw processing power and rely on fluid intelligence. Or you may have made decisions like this or similar to this one, and you can rely on your past experience and expertise in this domain. So very generally then, we would say that both crystallized and fluid intelligence should positively contribute to good decisions. And we also know that one increases with age and one decreases with age. So overall, if you want to consider the effect of cognitive aging on decision-making ability, then if fluid intelligence is more important for this type of task, it's certainly going to be the effect that aging should make you worse at decision-making, and vice versa. If crystallized intelligence is more important, then you should actually get better, wiser as you age. So in an earlier paper, we looked at how this relationship plays out in a number of economic relevant what we call decision traits. So things like how patient you are at making economic choices. So here we find that actually there's no main effect of age on how patient you are in a set of laboratory intertemporal choices. But we also find the prerequisite underlying changes. So older people get better at knowing things, but they also get slower. Their brains are slower. And both of these, it turns out, do positively relate to how patient you are. Now, that's kind of interesting since, again, we're measuring this with things like your vocabulary and how much you generally know about the world, and this with these very abstract types of tests, which ostensibly are related to how smart you are, but they don't look like decision-making measures. So overall, adding these two effects together, we actually find that cognitive ability sort of is a wash. Your slowing down of your brain is made up for the fact that you have more expertise or experience in this type of decision-making. So next we wanted to, and by the way, everything we do controls for all sorts of different things, including demographics. I'm not gonna mention most of that. So the question then becomes, so these are laboratory measures. Let's move into the real world. Let's add some administrative data. And one thing we can do is to look at people's credit scores. I don't have to tell people in this room that credit scores are incredibly important for you and for doing research on people like you. So good scores can lead to substantial benefits, and it turns out that we can think of them as a very good measure of cumulative good financial decision making. That is, you have to keep making good choices throughout your life in order to build up your credit score. And a single bad decision can actually be pretty disastrous. A secondary question we had was, well, what is it about vocabulary and general knowledge that helps you make better decisions? And we thought perhaps it's not any general intellectual capital that we're dealing with. We're really gonna look at domain-specific types. And I'll get into more detail on the next slide. So we collected data from 619 US participants aged 18 to 82. This is I guess we call it a primary data set. 2/3 of these were from the Columbia University Center for Decision Sciences virtual lab database, and another 1/3 were from a broader sample that we got from a market research firm. So trying our best to be somewhat representative, although in no ways is this completely representative of the US sample. We collected data across 3 months, 4 waves, and down here I'll show you that we collect general crystallized intelligence and fluid intelligence measures. These are all very standardized. The only difference is we're doing this online. We also have 2 measures of what we are gonna call domain-specific crystallized intelligence. So how much you know about the financial domain and how much you know about the health domain. We're also gonna include a number of covariates that people in this room might care about, things like your personality traits, in this case, Big 5, how much financial experience you have. These are measures of what some people will call economic phenotypes, so your risk preferences, your time preferences, how loss averse you are. We measure these using some state-of-the-art adaptive tasks that Eric and his co-authors came up with. And then we actually have 2 other additional tasks which we liken to real-world tasks, but which are more one-shot in nature. And we're gonna use those as robustness checks. So importantly, we're able to get credit reports for 73% of respondents. All respondents agreed to have us pull their credit, but a lot of these people just could not be found. So I'm gonna jump straight into results here. Needless to say, we've done much more sophisticated things, and we've also done much simpler things. They all tell the same story, and that's that overall credit scores seem to increase with age. This is not just true in our sample, it's true worldwide. We also see that fluid intelligence, again, decreases with age, and crystallized intelligence increases with age. People in this room will pay attention to the fact that these confidence spans are expanding. That's in part due to the fact that we don't have that many 70 and 80-year-olds. So remember, these are all online participants, so as you get later into the age range, you're gonna have a harder time getting online. Oh, more importantly, we have something which gets better with age, something which gets worse with age, and both of these are positive related to credit scores. So how much you know about, in this case, financial literacy and how smart you are both positively predict how good your credit score is. So what can we take away from this? Well, let me give you a concrete example. So take Anne, who's a 44-year-old college graduate. She earns about $50,000 a year and has average cognitive ability. So in this case, she would be a very typical median participant in our sample. And we would predict that she has a 693 FICO score. So good, but not excellent. Now, what happens if we were to increase her fluid intelligence by 1 standard deviation? We're talking about a 714 FICO score, just barely crossing into that excellent threshold. If we were to instead increase her financial literacy by 1 standard deviation, it would suggest a 740 FICO score. Now, I'm maybe sounding like I'm making causal statements here. I'm not. These are all correlational relationships, but nonetheless, they're evocative and very large effects. So if both were to increase, we would actually get her into the top echelon of FICO scores and save her perhaps $25,000 on a $300,000 30-year fixed mortgage. Now, things get much worse if we go the other direction. If she instead loses 1 standard deviation of financial literacy and 1 standard deviation of fluid intelligence, then she's just barely subprime, and she's paying an extra $77,000 of interest. So, because you're an economist, I'll talk about robustness checks. So, remember earlier we were talking about this domain general crystallized intelligence. That suggests that overall there's something about the big picture intellectual capital that you're picking up, which relates to perhaps decision making. And turns out that, at least in this study, we find no effect of general, that is domain general measures like your vocabulary and your general knowledge, that there's no relationship of this with FICO scores as long as we're controlling for your fluid intelligence. Of course, these are highly correlated, so if you look at it by itself, you still find this effect. Now, you might ask, is it simply because older adults have more financial experience? You've encountered more of these types of decisions? Is it just experience per se? It turns out that's not the case. So self-reports of your usage of a variety of 20 different financial instruments and products suggest that actually you can't just use it. You actually need to understand what you're doing. Actual expertise and knowledge is required. Could it be due to age differences in other underlying differences, such as risk, time, and loss preferences? Turns out if we include these as covariates, the results hold. And I will say that the time preferences do positively relate to credit scores, as others have found. We also can control for personality variables, which, again, some of these are going to correlate with FICO scores, but overall, our underlying complementary capabilities framework still stays. Oh, we looked at 2 other one-shot decisions, and I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go over these very quickly. One of these is the credit card repayment task, which Amar et al. Popularized. The idea is you have one of 2 credit cards to pay off. One of them has a higher APR. If you do this rationally, you should pay off the higher APR credit card first with the stimulus check we're going to give you. But the natural instinct is to pay off a complete account, so this whole debt snowball idea. And we find that both, again, domain-specific financial literacy and your overall fluid intelligence both positively predict doing better at this task. In another task in the medical domain, we give people a choice of various medical plans. We tell them how often they're planning to go to the doctor, what their average expenses are, how many prescriptions they get. And this is actually really just a simple math problem, but surprisingly, both your medical literacy, your healthcare literacy, and your fluid intelligence both positively predict performance here. So, in summary, we found that credit scores and other financial decisions relate to both how smart you are and how much you know. The effect of age on decision making isn't just about your domain general knowledge, though. It's really about some domain-specific expertise that you need to build up. And that suggests that the effects of age on decision-making are going to be a little more subtle than simply older people get better or older people get worse. It's going to depend on the demands of the task. So it also suggests that we should help people in different ways. So for older people, they oftentimes will have the knowledge, they'll have the expertise, but new domains nonetheless will be a challenge. So think about something like selling your grandma a Bitcoin. This is something that no one has experience with yet, but is nonetheless something that may become increasingly important. So in these new domains, many of these one-shot tasks like when to select Social Security, well, you're gonna have to reduce fluid processing for older adults. So structuring and filtering the choice sets, doing things like providing decision aids, the sorts of things that make it easier on someone with a slower mind. But on the other hand, younger adults need help as well. They lack this expertise, so I'm running out of time, so I say give them that knowledge, but there are very specific requirements on that. Now, let me just end with a quick quote. This is by Charlie Munger. He says that the other big secret is that we're good at lifelong learning. Warren Buffett is better in his 70s and 80s in many ways than he was when he was younger. If we keep learning all the time, you have a wonderful advantage. So ending on a positive note, we're all still getting smarter here, so let's keep getting wiser and not slower with age. Thank you.
Our next speaker this morning is Charles Nathanson. He is an assistant professor of finance at the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University. His work focuses on house prices, and he has also conducted research on the allocation of talent in the U.S. economy. This morning, he will be presenting his paper, An Extrapolative Model of House Price Dynamics.
All right, well, thank you for that introduction, and I also want to thank the organizers of this conference. I think this is a wonderful conference. I've enjoyed it very much, and hopefully this is the first of many. So what I'm going to be talking about today is joint work with Ed Glazer at Harvard University, and our project is we're going to try to understand the large booms and busts in house prices. Now, I think this topic is quite important for consumer finance and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Buying a house is often the most important financial decision that people will make, and it's usually highly levered, which brings debt into play, which also involves consumer finance. And so I think understanding the large movements in house prices is really central to everything that we're doing here today and yesterday. So I want to put up a graph, first of all, to just, this is just an example of one city, Los Angeles, and I want to put it up just to show you what I mean by house price cycles. So what I'm plotting here, the red dotted line is just real house prices for the Los Angeles metro area, and the blue line is real rents that's provided by the BLS, which you can think of roughly as maybe a measure of the fundamental demand to live in the city, whereas the red is giving you house prices. And they're both indexed to 1 in 1980. So a couple things really jump out of this plot. First is that house prices seem to be very volatile. So as you could see here in the late 2000s, we have the enormous rise and then fall in house prices that we all know about. There was also a similar cycle in the late 80s and early 90s. Secondly, you'll see that not a lot of this can actually be explained by movements in fundamentals such as rents. Now, how you define fundamentals is a little tricky, and I'll come back to this. But for instance, if you just look from 2000 to, say, 2006, you'll see rents real rents did indeed rise 40%, but house prices rose about 160%. So I'm going to keep coming back to this throughout the talk as an example, but I just really want you to hold this in your mind. House prices go through these enormous booms and busts, especially relative to fundamentals. And again, tying it back to consumer finance, you know, if you imagine what's happening to people who were buying in 2005, 2006 near the peak, they're going to be highly underwater in their houses very soon. And so this is something that we really want to understand. So our paper is we're going to try to present a model that's going to capture what we think of as key stylized facts about these housing cycles. And so what are the key stylized facts? Well, we're going to focus on 4 of them, and I want to point out that these 4 they hold, it's not just in Los Angeles, they're going to hold across the United States. And it's not just in the 2000 cycle. a lot of these facts were present even before 2000. So we think of these as really core facts about the dynamics of house prices that a theory of housing cycles needs to explain. So the first fact is momentum. What I mean by momentum is that when house prices go up in a year, on average, they go up the subsequent year about 70% as much in the same metropolitan area. This fact is very odd from the point of view of arbitrage or asset pricing, where you would think that people should be able to forecast this momentum and homebuyers should increase their bids or sellers should increase their asking prices and arbitrage this away. But that doesn't seem to happen, and there's this enormous momentum in house prices. And the seminal paper on this by Case and Schiller was published in 1989. So momentum already exists in house prices at that point. The second fact is long-term reversals in house prices. So if on average, when house prices go up in a year, 5 years later, on average, they decline by about 32 cents of that dollar increase. And again, this fact was present in work that I've done. We used data only going up to 2003, and we still found that relationship. The third fact is very high volatility relative to fundamentals. So about 3 times, if you use income as a measure of fundamentals, house prices seem to be changing much more than that. And we saw that as an example on the previous slide when I plotted rents as a measure of income. And the final fact is that there's some evidence of extrapolation on the part of home buyers. Now, what do I mean by extrapolation? Well, if you ask homeowners, how much do you expect the value of your house or house prices in your area to increase next year, there seems to be a very strong relationship between what they say and what has recently happened to house prices. So in a survey by Case, Schiller, and Thompson, they asked homeowners in 4 different metro areas over about 15 years this question, and their responses are on average about 23% of the previous year's increase. So if house prices went up 10% last year, then they'll say they expect them to go up 2.3% the next year. Now, one thing you might realize is that that 23% number is actually a lot smaller than the 70% number, which is the empirical reality. And I want you to hold that thought, because I will come back to that later. Okay, so we have these 4 key facts, and many papers have been written, too many to mention in my limited time here, trying to explain these facts, and many rational models have been written, and they've struggled to present a parsimonious model of all 4 of these facts simultaneously. And if you're interested, I refer you to this, a new volume of the Regional Urban Economics Handbook recently came out. I urge you to look at it. We have a chapter in there reviewing this, but there are a lot of other good papers as well. So what we're going to do here is we're going to present a model that's actually based on consumer learning. So it's going to relate to this extrapolation point that we are going to show can explain all 4 of these facts at the same time. And to illustrate the model, I want to walk through in a graphical form what our assumptions are and how it's going to work. So let's think about, so here I'm just plotting the data from Los Angeles, and I'm just going up to 2004. And I want you to imagine that you're a home buyer in 2004, and you're deciding how much to pay for your house. And that's what that red dot is supposed to represent. Now, the first ingredient in our model is just the observation that what you think about the future path of house prices is going to affect how much you're willing to pay today. Because, for instance, you may expect to live in your house only a short amount of time, say 7 to 10 years. So how much you think you can sell it for will affect how much you want to pay. So buying a house is going to involve forecasting where prices will go. Now, how do you do that? Well, if you could observe fundamentals, then you would have actually a simple forecasting exercise of matching fundamentals to prices. But our next ingredient in the model is the assumption that fundamentals are actually difficult to observe. Now, we used rents as a measure of fundamentals, but in a lot of areas, housing isn't rented. And so there isn't comparable rental series in certain areas. And so you're stuck trying to think about how much are people willing to, what's sort of the underlying demand to live in your city, how good are the schools, how good is the job market going to be in the future. And so we're going to assume that you can't directly observe that. And so what do you do instead? Well, one thing you could do is to simply just use the past history of house prices to try to infer what the fundamental demand to live in the city is. After all, demand is going to affect house prices in the past. So we're going to assume that people will look at prices to try to forecast where they'll move in the future. Now, to do that, that's actually a problem that can be solved correctly if everyone is being what we call perfectly rational. So if you know that demand affects prices, and you know that you're trying to look at past prices to figure out how demand affects prices, and you know that prices in the past were also formed that way by people doing the same thing, then you can actually perfectly filter out what that blue line was that I took away just from looking at prices. But what we show in the paper is that doing that is extremely difficult, and that it involves very unintuitive formulas that are actually quite fragile. And so what we do then is, in our opinion, that motivates considering simpler rules. And so we consider one rule of thumb in particular that we call naive extrapolation. And we use the term naive following some work by Eric Eisner and Matthew Rabin that's related to this. Now, in naive extrapolation, people simply assume that house prices are just equal to fundamentals. Okay? So what that means is they think that these movements in house prices are just tracing out how much people are willing to pay, or how much the underlying demand is to live in the city. Now, this assumption is actually not that bad in the scheme of mistakes that people could make, because on average, this is actually going to be correct. It's kind of has mean zero error. House prices are, in the long run, equal to fundamentals. And so it's a good approximation. But what's wrong with it is that it's going to ignore short-term movements in prices, and particularly the one we're going to focus on is it's going to ignore movements in people's expectations of the growth rate. So what I mean by this is, consider in 2000, you see in the last 4 years, house prices went up a lot, 80%. If you're being naive, you think that's an 80% increase in the demand to live in Los Angeles. Whereas in reality, maybe it's a 40%, well, we know it was something like a 30 or 40% increase. And on top of that, there was an increase in people's expectations of housing price growth. And so what happens is, as prices go up, subsequent periods of people look at those house price increases and they revise their expectations of demand upwards, generating momentum. But they're going to overstate how much housing demand is going up because they're ignoring the fact that part of that increase is people simply changing their expectations of the growth rate. And so what you'll get is, you'll get momentum, but you also get overshooting, and then an eventual reversal. And so this one mistake, which is actually not such a bad mistake to make, can generate all of the stylized facts that I put up on the first slide. And that's what I'm going to show you in my remaining time. I'm going to try to show you exactly how that works. Now, one comment you could have at this point is to simply say, okay, well, maybe people do make this mistake, but maybe that's because they don't have experience, and people with more experience in the housing market shouldn't make this mistake. So you might see, experts would know how to price houses, and they could tell people not to make this mistake. And so if that's true, you definitely wouldn't see experts making this mistake in 2005. You definitely would not see 3 leading housing economists making this mistake, and you certainly would not see 3 leading housing economists making the mistake in a journal whose purpose is to disseminate the research of economists to the general public. But that's actually exactly what happened. So Himmelberg, Mayer, and Sinai wrote a paper in the Journal of Economic Perspectives in 2005 where they're trying to assess if there was a housing bubble in the housing market. And at the crucial moment of assuming what they're using a user cost model. And the crucial thing there is, what is people's expectation of the growth rate? And they literally do what I just said people would do here. They don't account for changes in that growth rate and just use the long run average taken from house prices. So again, this mistake has a 0 error on average and was used by leading housing economists, and so we think it's something that's very reasonable. Okay, so let me keep going here. So we're able to derive a couple theoretical predictions, although the bulk of our work is going to be based on simulations because of the kind of dynamics in the model that are complicated to capture. But we can show in a simple case when people just observe the last 2 years of house prices that autocorrelations in prices follow a sinusoidal form, which is exactly what you'd want to see. In the short run, you have positive momentum, and then in the long run, you have reversals. We can directly show that naive buyers do extrapolate. And furthermore, the functional form of the extrapolation is actually almost identical to what's usually just assumed in a lot of the extrapolation literature. So people's expectations of house price growth is just going to be a weighted average of past house price growth with geometric weights that decrease as time goes in the past. People aren't going to forecast busts in this model because demand is going to have some persistence but no reversion, and people think prices equal demand, so they're not actually going to forecast eventual bust in prices. Rational buyers are going to, so those are the people who don't make this mistake, they actually won't extrapolate. So we can show using a back in the envelope argument that they'll basically think prices are almost a random walk because they think that everything they know is incorporated into prices, and so they would never do what you see in the Case-Shiller and Thompson survey of seeing people expect large increases in house prices. So rational buyers would never do that. Buyers are going to ignore information about demand. So even if they could observe fundamentals, if that observation is noisy, they'd actually rather just stick with prices as long as they can observe a very large number of home sales. Because if they think prices are just giving them fundamentals, if you can have a good observation of that, then if someone gives you some noisy measure of demand like unemployment, you'd just ignore that. And finally, naive buyers will be overconfident because they think that their measure of demand is a lot more accurate than it actually is. So what we do then is we go into, we try to see if we can account for the movements in prices in a quantitative way. And what's nice about our model is that our hands are really tied by parameters that exist in housing data. So we don't get to assume a say, extrapolation parameter. That's just going to be given to us by moments of the housing market. And so we are just going to use moments that have to do with static measures of the housing market, like how frequently people move. We're not estimating anything based on momentum and mean reversion. Now, to be clear, there is a little bit of massaging that's needed to be able to hit the moments exactly, and we account for this by having a lot of sensitivity analysis in the paper. But the point we're making here is that parameters that are reasonable can actually can capture quantitatively with what's going on empirically in the housing market. So the first thing we show is an impulse response so these are all simulations, and so we show the naive prices as well as what would happen if everyone was rational or if they could just directly observe demand. And the naive price is the red one, and you see that you get a big overshooting and you get a lot of momentum and you get these cycles. So that's exactly what we would want. Now, the next thing we do is we see how well can we match the autocorrelations in prices. So here we show the first column is, these are all pooled autocorrelations. So we just run a lot of simulations and just compute pooled covariances. We show that in the data, the first column, you see strong momentum at 1 year and weaker momentum at 2 years, and then some reversals. You get that broad picture in the naive simulation, which is the second column, but you basically don't get that at all when everyone's rational or if they can just observe demand directly. What about volatility? Well, to do volatility, again, we're going to compute some pooled standard deviations of price changes. And I actually think it's more illustrative to compare within the simulation volatility of prices to volatility of fundamentals, which is the bottom line. And what you'll see is that, especially at longer horizons, there's just much more volatility in naive price changes relative to fundamentals than in rational or observable price changes. And then turning to the fourth fact that I put up at the beginning of the talk, what happens to people's expectations. So these are, on average, after prices go up, the dotted line is what naive buyers think will happen to prices, and the red line is what actually happens. And what you see is the naive people, in the subsequent year, they expect about a 20% increase, which matches what Case-Shiller and Thompson found, and then they don't expect the bust. And then coming back to that point earlier, they are going to actually under-extrapolate relative to what happens to prices. Now, why is that? Well, you may have already figured it out, but the reason is if you think prices are just given by fundamentals, then you don't realize that the price increase today is going to trigger the people tomorrow to revise their beliefs up and continue this chain. And so you actually end up under-anticipating how much prices are going to go up. And so I think it's nice that we can actually capture that feature of the data. Okay. Finally, in the remaining time I have, just quickly, I want to talk about implications for consumer education because this is a CFPB conference. And so again, I want to go back to 2004 in Los Angeles and think, what would we do if, what would we want to tell homebuyers then, knowing what we do now, what would we want to tell them, basically, if we were just restricted to the data that we had up to 2004? So one thing you might be tempted to do is you'd say, okay, let's just tell people to be perfectly rational. Yes, I did say it involves complicated formulas, but maybe we can teach everyone to do that, and that way we could probably get these cycles out of house prices. Well, a problem with doing that is you might not be able to convince everyone to be rational. Maybe you could convince some people, but remember, these prices, this is an equilibrium outcome. And so an issue you have to grapple with is what happens if you can only convince some people to change. So to investigate this, what we did here is we computed, so this is your forecast accuracy, so it's the standard deviation of the error of what you think the long-run value of your house is. And on the left is what it is, so this is for an individual person. On the left, we toggle if that individual person is acting rational or naive. Rational means you assume everyone else is rational as well. And then here we say, what is everyone else doing? That's on the top. Are they all acting rational or naive? So first, the corners are telling you what the equilibrium outcome is if everyone is rational or everyone is naive. And sure enough, everyone being rational improves forecast accuracy by doubling it. But if you, as an individual, acted rational while everyone else was acting naive and you mistakenly thought everyone was rational and just blindly used the rational updating formula, this is your forecast error. Okay, now that's somewhat an that's just pooled over a 30-year period, but it really would sort of be infinity because we're dealing with something that's not stationary. Now, of course, the rational person would realize that other people aren't being rational. So, this is somewhat of just sort of just me being a little provocative, but the general point is that, how you act, the optimal way to act depends on how everyone else is acting, and if you can't observe that, it's tricky. Now, as a side note, if everyone was acting rational and you acted naive, then your forecast error is that. Only 12,000, which is very close to the 11,000. So you actually can basically free ride off of the aggregation that everyone else is providing. And actually, these numbers are even closer than they seem because of rounding. They're actually both in the 11,000s, and just rounded the top one down, the bottom one up. So all these things suggest that it's difficult to get people to change how they behave. So I just want to close, this is my last slide, just with a little speculation about what should we do, either as economists or policymakers, to educate people here. And I already mentioned the first problem is that the optimal updating depends on what other people are doing. So another strategy you could use is, what about just telling people about the general dynamics of house prices? So just telling them just the true statement that, on average, if prices are going up, they're probably going to go down 30% in 5 years. Zillow's actually doing something like this already. They actually, on their website now, have price forecasts, but they only do it for 1 year out. And you can do it on the house level, actually. Now, there are various issues with this. If everyone starts using those rules, then the actual autocorrelations could change. You also would have to tell people that they're under anticipating momentum, and that could lead to maybe even more trend chasing in the housing market. The last approach that I thought about is maybe we could just teach people more about how to hedge away house price risk, which is something that Robert Shiller has advocated repeatedly. And not only would that remove risk, but it also might actually make prices a lot more stable, because now when people buy a house, they're not thinking about the price at which they can sell it. They're only thinking about their willingness to pay to occupy it for, say, 7 years. And it's possible that if we move to that equilibrium, then prices would start to look a lot more like rents, and that would probably be a good thing because it would reduce a lot of volatility. So in closing, I really urge everyone here to think a little bit about how to solve this problem. I think there are huge welfare gains to making house prices less volatile if it's true that they're only volatile because people are making a simple mistake. And I think if we can think of a way to educate people in a way that will reduce volatility, then that would be a very good thing. So thanks for your time.
Our next speaker is Dan Bartels. He is an assistant professor who teaches consumer behavior at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. This morning, he will be presenting his paper, To Know and to Care, How Awareness and Valuation of the Future Jointly Shape Consumer Savings.
It's on now. Thanks very much. I'm really excited. This is all wet up here. I'm really excited to be here. This has been a highly stimulating conference with a good end, and so I'm very happy to be able to participate in it. So this is some work that I've been doing with Oleg Erminsky. It comes out of sort of a broader line of research where I've been interested for the past several years in trying to understand how the way that people think about their self over time, the continuity of them over time, influences the forward-looking choices that they make. And because I work at the University of Chicago, I've learned to give the upshot on the title slides, and sometimes you never get past the title slide. which is that when people think, when people think that the important psychological properties that make them who they are preserved in their future self, that bolsters their motivation to provide for that future self. If they feel like those properties go away, it can undercut their motivation to provide for that future self. And so in situations where people are making a conscious, explicit trade-off between their current welfare and their future welfare, we often see that people who feel relatively disconnected from the future self make less sort of patient or prudent forward-looking choices. So like I said, I've been interested in this topic, and I've been interested in a bunch of sort of quirks of temporal discounting. So to boil down, 78 years worth of brilliant research into four bullet points, here are some stylized facts. One is that people are awfully impatient, so that means that people discount the value of delayed rewards more than can be justified by some kinds of models. People are more impatient for outcomes that they can realize now than for things that have a front-end delay attached to them, right? This is sometimes captured in terms of hyperbolic or quasi-hyperbolic discounting. People differ in their patience, so there are pretty reliable differences between people. Some people make sort of more consistently patient decisions in reference to other people who are less patient. But there's also a difference like within people, right? So some of the decisions that you make might paint you to be relatively patient, whereas others might paint you to be relatively patient. And so for the past handful of years, I've been trying to use this idea of thinking about the continuity of the future self to help us understand these kinds of stylized facts. I'm not only interested in temporal discounting and in patience because I'm interested in like the shape of the function, but it's also the case, right, that many of us with sort of a practical bent care about discounting because the general idea is that lots of decisions that consumers make ultimately distill to intertemporal choices, even if we don't appreciate this fact. And so, for example, some flavors of financial self-help that is offered up to people by financial self-help authors look like this. They're about basically people, bleeding to death by 1,000 tiny cuts. So this is David Bach, author of a book called The Latte Factor, being interviewed on CNN, and he says, if you're wasting $5 a day on little things like a latte at Starbucks or a muffin, you can become very rich if you cut back on that and put that money basically in a 401k or an IRA. You can be a multimillionaire by the time you reach retirement by simply finding your latte factor, title of the book, and paying yourself back, right? So this potentially over-optimistic advice is also incredibly difficult to follow. It's kind of like Charlie's suggestion that we just tell people to be rational. What this means is that every time, right, it means that every time you make any decision, no matter how large or small it is, you have to meet this challenge of consumer savings, to not splurge when you don't want to splurge. You have to you actually have to cognitively book the impact of this thing, right, for your future welfare. And then, importantly, you also have to care a lot, right, about the person who stands to benefit from your forbearance. And lots of us actually assume some stuff about this that I'm gonna talk a little bit about. So lots of us think that this young man here, right, has lots of good reason to spend wisely, to save a lot of money, because he's going to persist. There's this guy out here who has his name, who lives in his body, so that's him, right? And so this guy will be around to reap the health and financial rewards associated with this guy's prudent behavior, and because it's the same guy, that rationalizes the behavior, right? So that's something that many of us take for granted. However, there's a whole branch of, believe it or not, metaphysics. So there's a philosophy of personal identity. And in this branch of philosophy, there are lots and lots of philosophers who say that that's not the right way to think about a lifetime. That people are actually composed of these various person stages or selves that are distributed across time. So the idea is that the person who went to bed in your body last night shares lots of psychological connections, lots of shared goals, memories, values, beliefs, ideals with the person who woke up in your body this morning, right? But those things that make you who you are and that constitute you, right, that those things change a little bit over time, such that you might imagine that way off in the distant future, after 30 years of these tiny little changes accumulating, that future person is not fully you. I don't mean to overplay the analogy. It's not that this is some stranger, like it's some guy on the bus, right? It's just not fully you, right? And so some philosophers, and famously Derek Parfit, have argued that this might give you some reason to care a little bit less about those future states of your life. So if you can get 10 utils now or 10 utils in 30 years, and in 30 years that you is not fully you don't fully get to experience those 10 utils, that gives you reason to want to consume now instead, right? So this is a highly, highly, highly controversial argument in philosophy. This guy, who's a brilliant guy, collected up chapters from 18 other brilliant philosophers who all say this idea is wrong. I'm not going to engage in that sort of normative debate. I'm just interested in whether or not people think this way about their own lifetimes and whether it influences the kinds of choices that they make. So this, when I talk about psychological connectedness, it's a very sort of pie-in-the-sky concept, so it's useful to give you sort of the operational definition. Here's how we measure it, and it turns out that even though this is a kind of pie-in-the-sky kind of concept, people give us responses that seem perfectly reasonable. They can answer these questions. So we ask them to think about the important characteristics that make you who you are, your personality, temperament, major likes and dislikes, beliefs, values, ambitions, life goals, and ideals, because this is basically the set of stuff that these the people that endorse these so-called four-dimensional views of personal identity, these are the things they say are important, right? So then thinking about these characteristics, we're basically asking them to do a very a restricted kind of similarity comparison, right? A similarity comparison that's predicated on these characteristics. Think about the person that you're going to be in a year and tell us how much you think that these things are going to be also true of that person, right? So we've had people do things like choose from a set of Euler circles or manipulate overlap in Euler circles or give us a 0 to 100 similarity rating, etc. You can do this over even very long periods of time, and people's ratings don't go down to 0. They're monotonically decreasing. So in other words, people give us responses that suggest to us they know how to interpret this concept and map it onto some scale, right? By now, there's actually been a fair amount of work looking at this sort of future self idea. So Shane Frederick provided an initial exploration in his dissertation. Lance Rips and I showed that that changes in connectedness over time parallel changes in patience over time. So over those periods of time in the future in which you anticipate the greatest amount of personal change, you are the least patient. It correlates with self-reported asset accrual. There's some neural evidence that's consistent with this stuff. And it's also the sort of thing that you can manipulate. So I'm going to give you an example of that. So Oleg Erminsky and I approached graduating seniors at the University of Chicago 7 to 10 days before their commencement ceremony. And we had them read one of two passages about college graduation as it relates to their personal identity. And I should say I'm a cognitive psychologist. I've never actively deceived a subject. It turns out that both of these passages are true. It's just selective reporting. So some people read that day-to-day life events change appreciably around college graduation, but what changes the least is your core identity. These traits that I rattled off earlier, those are established early in life and fixed by the end of adolescence, and studies find that these things don't move around. The other people read selective reporting about how people change more than we think, right? Then we offered them incentive-compatible choices. So they're told that by completing this survey, they'd entered into a lottery to receive a gift certificate, so they get $120 for Amazon when we determine the winner in a week, or they could wait for larger value gift certificates. So if feeling disconnected from the future self causes impatience, then the idea is that the people who read that college graduation will change them fundamentally as a person should select fewer of these delayed rewards. In fact, they do. Lots of other really important things go along with this change. So you might anticipate changes in future financial or time resources or constraints. You might anticipate that your preferences will change. And those things can, should, and do influence discounting. But it turns out that this effect does not reduce to an effect of these particular factors, right? So all of this work has suggested that when people are making these trade-offs that are super salient, connectedness affects the kinds of decisions that they make. An open question is whether trade-offs are generally salient in the kinds of decisions that consumers make. And there's now a fair amount of work on this. So basically, people who self-report considering the future consequences of their choices and elaborating on likely outcomes make more sort of prudent-looking, forward-looking choices. Propensity to plan, this is John Lynch, Stephen Spiller, and their colleagues, predicts things like FICO scores. When people are running out of money at the end of the month, they're more likely to spontaneously generate opportunity costs for how they spend their money. Shane Frederick, Nathan Novemsky, and their colleagues have a paper that suggests that Most people aren't thinking about opportunity cost. If you cue them into thinking about opportunity cost, it reduces discretionary spending. And so the idea, right, is that trade-offs might not be generally salient, at least not for everybody all the time. This hasn't been lost on behavioral economists who are interested in helping people. And so there are a whole bunch of projects underway that are about basically sending people text messages or email reminders of the consequences of failing to save or doing these prudential things like following through on their plans. And these things do move the needle. The question is whether they could do even better, right? And so our premise is that there's a very big difference between thinking about the future at all and caring about it, and that you actually need to tackle both of these things to really help consumers out, right? So how would you establish whether or not this is the case? Well, so what we did is we manipulated them orthogonally. So in this study, we manipulated connectedness with using a passage kind of like the one that I showed you earlier. And then we also manipulated the salience of the trade-off inherent in the choice, right? So you can buy a more expensive iPad, a less expensive iPad, or not buy either one. In our high opportunity cost salience condition, we just gave them this little placebo reminder, right? Leaving you $100 that you could do anything else in the world with, right? It's just supposed to heighten the sense of the trade-off. And what you see is that when people are not reminded of opportunity costs, manipulating connectedness does not significantly affect how much they choose to spend. When you do remind them of, highlight trade-offs in the situation, now making them feel more connected to the future self significantly reduces their discretionary spending for this thing that they themselves view to be kind of splurgy. So there's two ways to look at this. So the idea is if we just look at the people for whom we think we've imputed this motivation to save for the future, even these people need a nudge, right? And among the people that get these nudges, right, the idea is the people who are also made to care about that future self are more likely to respond to the nudge. This is very quick. So this is whether or not to buy a DVD. Again, we were in half of the conditions. This is nowhere near where it's supposed to be. Anyway, in half of the conditions, people are reminded of the trade-off inherent in this, and then we measured connectedness and propensity to plan after people made their choices. What we find is that there's no correlation with connectedness, or there's no significant correlation when opportunity costs are not highlighted. There is a correlation when opportunity costs are highlighted. So the dash bars are going to be people who sort of compulsively think about trade-offs, and the solid bars, the solid line will be people who don't. And if you remind people of trade-offs and you manipulate connectedness, you reduce spending for both groups. Interestingly, right, these people who are high in propensity to plan basically don't need this reminder, right? They're compulsively thinking about these things, and so they reduce spending with high connectedness. This we predicted to be flat, and as you can see, it's not flat at all. So that was a quirk of our data that we never have figured out why that happens. So this study is really about two things. One is about more sort of naturalistic ways in which people might actually prioritize their spending and think about trade-offs. And the other one is this is going to speak to whether or not we're just making people tightwads or whether we're getting people to make more prudent financial choices. So our manipulation, so again, we're manipulating connectedness, high and low connectedness. Manipulation of trade-off salience here is so people are asked about 6 product categories. So pocket video cameras, blenders, bed sheets, pocket watches, etc. And they're asked to rank them from the thing that I most want to spend money on to the thing that I least want to spend money on. And our manipulation of opportunity cost salience is whether they do that task before or after a choice task in which they're offered a cheaper and a more expensive version within that product category, right? So the idea is if you've done the ranking task first, you've considered a bunch of other uses of your money. And so here's the result. It's restricted to, interestingly, right, so when you rank first, so in our high trade-off salience condition, manipulating connectedness, causing people to feel more connected to the future self, causes them to spend less, but specifically, it causes them to spend less on the items that they've just told us they don't care about, right? So we're not making people across the board sort of tightwads. We're causing them to engage in more focused spending on the things that actually bring them value, right? All right, so very quickly, we've actually seen lots of talks now that have talked about these ways of eliciting time preferences, right? And you might notice that the way that we elicit these things in the lab involves some very, very explicit trade-offs, right? You can have $120 now or $206 in a year, right? It's an explicit trade-off. Connectedness affects discretionary purchase. When we highlight these trade-offs, there have been a bunch of papers, including by people in this room, right, where you use laboratory-derived estimates to try to predict real-world behaviors. And sometimes this works out where you see lots of stuff predicted by these laboratory estimates, and sometimes it doesn't. And so a second sort of point of this study is to ask whether maybe discount rates are better predictive of people's discretionary spending decisions or better predictive of behaviors when those behaviors are especially trade-offy. So this is actually just a small part of something that Yi Li and I are now doing, where we're trying to understand which behaviors are and aren't predicted well by laboratory-derived estimates of discounting. And so we gave people, again, an iPad purchase kind of scenario, reminded half of the participants that there's a trade-off involved. Then we measured time preference. So 3.5 results on one slide. The first is that people who are made to feel more highly connected to the future self are more patient. The second result is the one that I've shown you, which is that reminding people about opportunity costs and manipulating connectedness decreases the spend. The third is that spending here is correlated with differences in time preference when people are reminded of it, and the difference in spending is mediated by the difference in time preference that is caused by our manipulation of connectedness only when trade-offs are queued and not at all when trade-offs are not queued. Finally, back to the real world, it turns out that you run this at a coffee shop and you can reduce how much people spend on coffee and pastries as well. So here's the idea. Consumers restrain their spending when they're both connected to the future self and when they're thinking about trade-offs. The idea is that connectedness is one of those things that relates to valuing the future, is one of those things that might be one of the motivational components of time preference. And so it's a key element of the motivation to save for the future, but you can't really act on that unless you recognize that what you're doing now, I mean, it seems obvious, but unless you actually recognize that what you're doing now affects that future version of you. So if we want to help people meet the challenge of consumer savings, one idea is that increasing connectedness without reminders of trade-offs, so there actually are some firms and that are doing things that look like connectedness increasing tactics, and doing that without highlighting trade-offs is probably less likely to be effective. And trade-off reminders on their own are likely to be a lot more, or when paired with connectedness, increasing tactics are likely to be more effective. So thanks very much.
Our discussant this morning is Lingling Ang. She is an economist at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and was one of the original staffers when the Bureau was established. Her research and policy work focus on student loans, disclosure, and benefit cost analysis.
Hi, everyone. Before I get started, I have to tell you that the views expressed here are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect those of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau or the United States. Now that I've said that, I can tell you that I enjoyed reading all 4 of these papers. So I enjoyed them so much, actually, that I've already applied them in my policy work by sharing the highlights with my colleagues. You see, at the Bureau, we work shoulder to shoulder with lawyers and policy analysts, and the success of our policies really depends on our ability to work together and understand each other's skills. We're kind of like the Mighty Ducks. We're led by a lawyer from the Midwest, and we have to color everything green. So anyhow, policy analysis involves identifying an issue and establishing who it affects, how it affects them, and to what extent it affects them. We start with candidate policies that are legally feasible, implementable, and hopefully welfare improving. It's kind of daunting when you realize that there is in fact a social planner, and it's you. Lawyers have called meetings to walk through my self-directed research, estimate by estimate, and at first I was really excited until I realized that they wanted a magic number that could help them rank order different policy alternatives, and I realized that, that's not what research does. Given our limited time and limited cognitive ability, we use the tools at hand to draw inference. Academic research is particularly useful in this respect because while it may not give us those magic numbers that would let us tell you what the best policy is at any given time, it does give us a fair amount of insight into directionality, heterogeneity, as well as how to frame problems. So the set of papers that we have here today are really interesting and can be applied directly to our work. They answer questions about how consumers process information and how consumer financial skills are formed. They also demonstrate the diversity of consumers and consumer response to stimuli. This is particularly applicable to the Bureau's work on disclosures. The Dodd-Frank Act requires us to test all of the disclosures that we implement, and hopefully the lessons learned from these papers can be shared amongst our teams and integrated into our benefit cost analyses. So let's just go in order here and start with Soren's paper. So he has that Danish data that we're all jealous of, and he actually managed to add more data to it by supplementing it by an additional survey. The main identification in this paper relies on IV that is based on the pre-period financial condition of an individual's household. So I really like the measure of household financial condition that they use insofar as they relate savings to 1 month of income. But I think that in addition, the authors should also consider using other financial condition measures. When thinking about the financial health of the household, I think it might be useful to think about measures that we've used in the financial health of financial institutions. So basically, Camel's ratings for the Bank of Mom and Dad. So the reason why I think that additional financial condition measures would be useful is because there may be a lot going on in terms of whether or not people are able to risk share. In particular, the extent to which people are leveraged may affect their ability to withstand shocks. In terms of identification, I think that there's a great opportunity here to exploit family characteristics and to build on the work that has used sibship and twins to identify within family effects versus across family effects. And I also think that they have a great opportunity to dig even deeper and get at the nature versus nurture question by making use of the Danish twin registry. I really liked the fact that Ye's paper brought the results of their survey to the real world by linking with credit scores. And it's really interesting to see that there are these two opposing forces, essentially fluid intelligence and then skill accumulation over time. I think that beyond consumer finance, this actually has broad applicability to a major line of research in labor economics in terms of the returns to experience. While consumer finance is done off the clock, I think that a really close analog is the returns to industry-specific experience. And so that's just a nice connection across fields. I'm also interested in seeing just the interaction between the effects of fluid intelligence and crystallized intelligence. Basically, I'd like to know if someone who is older but of lower cognitive ability is much worse off than someone who's lower, and while their cognitive ability has declined, they may still be relatively more sophisticated. Another extension that I'd be interested in is finding out how people deal with changes in the rules, either because of policy changes or changes in the market. One of the measures that the authors use is a question about required minimum disbursements from retirement accounts. And this is basically just a true-false question. I think that to get at how people may be using old information, they could make use of recent policy changes, such as the 2005 change in bankruptcy law that made private student loans non-dischargeable in bankruptcy, or the 2008 change in FDIC deposit insurance limits. So looking at Charlie's paper, basically what happens here is that individuals are a little bit too simplistic in their forecasting of house prices, and then what you end up with is a garbage in, garbage out situation. And given their model of house price forecasting, they actually are able to simulate a lot of the patterns that we see in the mortgage market today. So I was thinking about their naive consumers, and the more that I thought about them, the more that I realized that we need to think about the extrapolation process the consumers are going through. So think back to your first calculus class. Speed was pretty easy to understand. That was just the first derivative. And acceleration is something that we use every day in our conversation. But thinking about changes in direction, that's the third derivative. That's kind of mind-blowing. And then think about the fact that you all took calculus, and I'm assuming that you all did pretty well. That's really not the typical American experience. The US is currently ranked 27th in math out of the 34 OECD countries, according to the 2012 PISA. One of the key findings that was reported is that students in the United States have particular weaknesses in performing mathematical tasks with higher cognitive demands, such as taking real-world situations, translating them into mathematical terms, and interpreting mathematical aspects in real-world problems. So I think that an important line of inquiry would look at exactly where these cognitive limits bind. I'd also like to say kudos to Charlie for really replicating what we see in terms of self-reported house values. Bucks and Pence have shown that people are actually pretty reasonable about approximating their house prices. And Enrique's has shown that people do tend to be overly optimistic, overestimating house price growth in booms and underestimating declines in busts. Finally, I'd just like to make a couple of data suggestions. We have the NSMB crew here today, and I'd just like to mention that in this new survey, there are a couple of questions about house price expectations, and it would be great to be able to use this to validate the findings in the paper as the series becomes longer. Another quick aside, in terms of other data that's available, there are also self-reported housing values in the ACS, both in terms of owner-occupied housing and rents. So this might be useful in the quantitative portion of this paper, and it just gives you data at more frequent intervals. Last but not least, I really enjoyed Dan's paper, and I think that we can really apply this directly to our disclosure research. One of the key points that I took away from this paper is that we can't design components of forms in isolation and build a Frankenform. We really have to think about how things fit together. Since several of the experiments in this paper are administered through internet surveys, I think that there are also a few ideas here that we can just slightly modify and bring directly to our testing. In terms of extensions, I'd be really interested in learning about how this methodology and construct interacts with other goods. While we often talk about the $35 cup of coffee in the context of overdraft fees, many of the consumer decisions that we consider at the Bureau are related to much longer time horizons, even longer than one Apple generation. I'd like to learn how consumers respond to opportunity costs and connectedness to future self-framing in the context of housing and car decisions. And I think that cars would be especially interesting because different models tend to depreciate at different rates. Also, I think it would be interesting to see how consumers respond to purchases that are somewhat less discretionary. Another extension that I think we could find interesting is how framing affects expenditures on others, especially in a household context. We know that expenditures out of transfers differ based on who in the family you give the transfers to. It's the classic milk versus beer problem. A direct application in the consumer finance space would be parental co-signing or borrowing of student loans. So I really enjoyed these papers, and I think that I have a lot to bring back to my policy teams. The overarching theme is that context and how individuals interpret that context really matters. And not only do person-specific factors like inherited traits, exposure to behavior, experience, and cognitive function matter, but so does the context in which information is presented, as well as how it's processed. Consumer finance is a tall order, and small biases can have economy-wide effects. I'm excited to see how the panelists build on this research, and there's a positive probability that I'll be explaining your point estimates to some lawyers sometime soon. Thank you very much.
Before we move into Q&A, I was wondering if any of the panelists had any response to Ling-Ling's comments.
Thank you. I just want to say thank you for the comments. They're in fact so good, so we are already working on them. So as we speak here, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ling-Ling, for the comments. I have a few responses, some to things that you didn't actually ask about. One is you asked about the interaction between fluid and crystallized intelligence. It's something we're frequently asked about, and one way to think about this is that fluid intelligence actually accumulates over time to become crystallized intelligence. So if you start with less, you're not going to be able to accumulate as much experience and expertise as you otherwise would if you start off higher. Another is to think about actually moderators of what determine how much cognitive aging happens. It might comfort some people in this room that as long as you're highly educated, you have high SES, and you stay socially engaged, you actually have much slower cognitive aging. And there's a lot of variation in what we saw as an overall pretty depressing pattern. But I think for many people in this room, your experience is different. You don't feel like you've actually gotten that much worse off, and I probably think that's true. As my co-author likes to remind me, I'm one standard deviation higher than him, supposedly on this curve, but it doesn't matter if you start off much, much higher in the first place. Yep, thank you.
Thank you very much for the comments. They're really useful, and look forward to looking into the data sets that you mentioned and trying to think a little more carefully about how people form beliefs and trying to measure that more. So thanks.
Thank you. So that's right. So the convenient sort of prescriptive assumption that we made that is not right in lots and lots of circumstances is that spending is bad. And so all of the things for which people were reducing their spending were things that they themselves judged to be relatively sort of splurgy. So when we were earlier on when we were doing this research, we used some product categories in one or more of the studies where you really do get a much higher quality product if you spend more money. And for those kinds of things, we didn't observe these effects. And we asked people what was going on, and they were saying, well, if I want to do the responsible thing, I actually have to spend, like you were saying with the car, right? Like buy the car that will do well for me in the long run. So it does seem like the sorts of things that we've identified here that have been studied here are not well positioned to explain self-control failures that happen over the course of a minute or two, right? It has to be a relatively long-term thing, and it has to be something that people feel, that people have some idea about how reasonable the spending is. So I take those comments. And as for household, for thinking about how this extends to treating other people within one's own household, that's something we've thought a lot about, and it turns out to be an incredibly tricky problem. So, yeah, thanks.
I believe we have time for maybe one or two questions from the audience, if anyone has anything they'd like to ask. Oh, we don't? Okay. Sorry.